They found the boy under the table, shivering, pale, and barely breathing. His tiny chest rose and fell in desperate, uneven gasps that echoed through the sterile silence of the corporate boardroom like a broken metronome counting down precious seconds. "Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Let's share this story together." The fluorescent lights of Bennett & Associates hummed their relentless tune above the polished mahogany conference table, casting harsh shadows across the room where million-dollar deals were made and broken with the stroke of a pen. But tonight, beneath that same table where powerful executives had decided the fate of countless lives, lay a small bundle wrapped in a frayed blanket, a 6-year-old boy named Liam, whose fever-damp hair clung to his forehead like dark silk against porcelain. Sarah Martinez had been cleaning these offices for 2 years, her worn sneakers moving silently across marble floors at 2 a.m. when the building belonged to shadows and janitors. Her uniform, a faded blue shirt with cleaning services embroidered in letters that had lost their shine, hung loose on her thin frame, evidence of too many skipped meals and too many sleepless nights spent worrying about a child whose lungs seemed too small for this world. She'd discovered the hiding spot 3 months ago, during one of Liam's worst episodes, when his chronic pneumonia had flared and the emergency room had sent them home with nothing but a prescription she couldn't afford and advice to monitor his breathing. The space beneath the conference table was carpeted, warm from the heating vents, and most importantly, it was safe. Corporate executives never looked down. They were too busy looking ahead at profit margins and quarterly reports. Tonight was different. Tonight, Mr. Harrison, the building supervisor whose voice could freeze water, had decided to conduct one of his surprise inspections. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the marble with the precision of a countdown timer as he made his rounds, clipboard in hand, searching for violations to justify his inflated salary. "What's that noise?" Harrison's voice cut through the air like broken glass. He'd heard it, the soft, labored breathing that Sarah had learned to recognize as the sound of her son fighting for each breath. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. She'd been in the supply closet, mixing cleaning solutions with hands that trembled, not from the chemicals but from the constant terror of discovery. Every night was a gamble. Would Liam's breathing stay quiet enough? Would his fever break before dawn? Would someone finally notice the woman who'd been invisible for so long? "Whose child is this?" Harrison's bark shattered the silence as he dropped to his knees, peering under the table where Liam lay curled like a wounded bird, his small body wrapped in the only blanket they owned, a threadbare thing that had once been blue but now resembled the color of old bruises. 2 security guards materialized, as if summoned by the very scent of potential lawsuit, their walkie-talkies crackling with static that sounded like the whispers of Sarah's worst nightmares. She burst into the room, her cleaning gloves still dripping with disinfectant, her heart hammering against her ribs with the force of approaching doom. "He's mine." Please don't touch him," she cried, dropping to her knees on the cold marble, her voice breaking like waves against an unforgiving shore. Her arms wrapped around Liam's burning body, feeling the heat radiating through his clothes she'd washed by hand in the motel sink because the laundromat cost $3 she didn't have. Liam's eyes fluttered open, pale blue irises swimming in a sea of fever-induced confusion. "Mommy?" he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of every sacrifice she'd made, every dignity she'd surrendered, every dream she'd buried to keep him alive. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Harrison sneered, his face twisted with the particular disgust reserved for people who dared to be poor in places designed for prosperity. "For you hid a sick child in a corporate building, under our conference table during flu season. Do you have any idea what kind of liability—" "I didn't have a choice," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking like leaves in a winter storm. "He has chronic pneumonia. I couldn't leave him alone. The daycare closed last month. They couldn't handle his medical needs. I begged the neighbor. I called every babysitter in the phone book, but no one wants to watch a sick child for minimum wage. I was going to take him to the clinic right after my shift ended, I swear to you." "I don't care about your personal problems," Harrison interrupted, his words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples of humiliation that spread across Sarah's face. "You're terminated. Effective immediately. Pack your supplies and get out." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah felt something fundamental crack inside her chest, not her heart, for that would suggest something clean and merciful. This was messier, more devastating, like the sound of load-bearing walls finally surrendering to pressure they were never designed to bear. "No, please," she whispered, rocking Liam against her chest as his small hand clutched weakly at her uniform. "I've worked here for 2 years. I've never been late, never missed a shift. I've cleaned these offices until they sparkled, worked through holidays when other people were home with their families. I just need 1 more week, just until payday so I can buy his medicine. Please, I'm begging you." But Harrison had already turned away, his attention shifting to the security guards with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. "Escort them out. Make sure she takes nothing that doesn't belong to her." As the guards stepped forward, their heavy boots echoing like thunder in the marble corridors, Sarah held Liam tighter and felt the last threads of hope snap inside her chest. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even lift her eyes to meet their stares. What was the point? She'd learned long ago that dignity was a luxury poor people couldn't afford, that fighting back only made the fall harder when it inevitably came. Outside in the parking garage, the February wind cut through Chicago's concrete canyon like a blade made of ice and despair. Sarah sat on the cold concrete floor, her back pressed against a concrete pillar that felt as unforgiving as the world itself. Liam lay across her lap, his small body burning with fever that seemed to radiate through his threadbare clothes and into her bones. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last meal, half a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple, had gone to Liam, who'd managed only a few bites before his stomach rebelled against food his body was too weak to process. Her own hunger had become a constant companion, a hollow ache that she'd learned to ignore the same way she'd learned to ignore the whispers of other parents at the free clinic, their eyes full of judgment for the woman who couldn't afford proper medicine for her child. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had spent 24 months making these corporate offices pristine, scrubbing away every trace of human presence until the marble gleamed like mirrors and the windows sparkled like crystal, now sat discarded in the building's bowels like the very trash she'd emptied from executive wastebaskets night after night. For 2 years, Sarah had been the ghost in the machine, the invisible woman who arrived after the last executive drove away in their luxury cars and left before the first one returned with their artisanal coffee and organic croissants. She'd memorized their schedules, learned their habits, knew which offices stayed occupied past midnight, and which ones could be cleaned while their occupants worked late. Too absorbed in their million-dollar deals to notice the woman with calloused hands polishing the surfaces they touched. She'd cleaned Mr. Peterson's office the night his wife gave birth to twins, mopping around the champagne bottles he'd left on his desk while he celebrated new life. She'd been there when Ms. Rodriguez received her promotion, carefully dusting around the congratulatory flowers that filled her office with their sweet perfume. She'd witnessed 1,000 small celebrations and intimate moments, always present but never acknowledged, like wallpaper that moved and breathed and hoped for recognition that never came. "You're lucky we even let you work here," Harrison had told her once, 6 months ago, when she'd asked if there was any possibility of a small raise. "Do you know how many people would kill for a steady cleaning job in a building like this? Benefits, vacation time? You think this is some kind of charity?" She'd never asked again. Instead, she'd worked harder, stayed later, taken on extra duties without compensation. She'd scrubbed floors until her knees bled through her pants, polished windows until her shoulders screamed in protest, emptied trash cans that reeked of expensive takeout from restaurants she'd never be able to afford. She'd done it all with the quiet desperation of someone who understood that gratitude was expected, not earned. The memories flooded back as she sat in the garage's fluorescent twilight, each one another weight added to the crushing load she'd been carrying for so long. There was the night she'd found a wallet in Mr. Bennett's office, the CEO's son, she'd learned later, containing more cash than she made in 3 months. She'd returned it immediately, leaving it on his desk with a note explaining where she'd found it. He'd never acknowledged her honesty, never even looked at her when she cleaned his office the following week. There was the Christmas bonus she'd been promised but never received, the explanation lost in corporate paperwork that no one seemed motivated to untangle. "These things take time," Harrison had said with the casual indifference of someone whose own bonus had arrived promptly. "Budget approvals, you understand? Maybe next quarter." Next quarter had become next year, and next year had faded into the understanding that some promises were made to be broken, especially when made to people whose voices didn't carry far enough to demand accountability. She remembered the night Liam had been hospitalized for the first time, his tiny body racked with pneumonia that turned his lips blue and his breathing into a desperate gasp for life. She'd called Harrison from the emergency room, her voice shaking as she explained she couldn't work her shift, that her son was fighting for his life, and she couldn't leave him alone. "This is very disappointing, Sarah," he'd said, his tone suggesting she'd chosen to inconvenience him rather than face a parent's worst nightmare. "We have important clients coming in tomorrow. Those offices need to be spotless. I hope you understand the position this puts me in." She'd hung up the phone and stared at her unconscious child, oxygen mask covering half his face, IV tubes snaking from his arms like lifelines, to a world that seemed determined to let him sink. That night, she'd made a choice that would haunt her for months. She'd called her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, begging her to sit with Liam for just a few hours so she could work her shift and keep the job that provided their health insurance. Mrs. Chen, bless her heart, had agreed despite her arthritis and her own medications that made her drowsy. Sarah had worked that night with tears streaming down her face, polishing conference tables, while her son lay unconscious 12 miles away, trusting a woman in her 70s to monitor breathing patterns that trained nurses found challenging. When she'd returned to the hospital at dawn, exhausted and reeking of industrial cleaning products, Liam had opened his eyes and whispered, "Mommy, where were you?" The question had pierced her soul like a blade, leaving a wound that never quite healed. "I was working, baby," she'd whispered back, stroking his fever-damp hair. "Mommy was working so you can get better." He'd nodded with the acceptance of a child who'd learned too young that survival required sacrifices he couldn't understand but had to accept. "I know, Mommy. You always work for me." That conversation had broken something inside her that she'd never been able to repair. She'd realized then that she wasn't just sacrificing her own comfort, her own dignity, her own dreams. She was sacrificing moments with her son that could never be recovered, memories that could never be made again, connections that were being severed, one missed bedtime story at a time. But what choice did she have? The job provided health insurance that kept Liam's medications affordable, barely, but affordable enough that she could buy them every month instead of every other month. It provided a steady income that, while insufficient for dignity, was sufficient for basic survival. It was more than many single mothers had, and Harrison never let her forget it. "You should be grateful," he'd said more than once, usually when she looked particularly worn down by the combination of physical exhaustion and emotional depletion that had become her baseline state. "Do you know how many people would love to have your job security?" Job security. The phrase tasted bitter in her mouth now as she sat on the concrete floor, her career reduced to cardboard boxes of cleaning supplies and a final paycheck that wouldn't even cover a week's worth of Liam's medications. 2 years of perfect attendance, of working through her own illnesses, of coming in early and staying late, of never complaining about the casual disrespect and systematic devaluation that had slowly eroded her sense of self-worth. All of it meaningless in the face of one desperate decision to keep her child safe. Now, in the parking garage's harsh light, she looked down at Liam's face and saw her own failure reflected in his fevered features. She'd failed to protect him from poverty, failed to provide him with the security that other children took for granted, failed to build a life stable enough that she wouldn't have to hide him under conference tables like a shameful secret. But as she held him closer, feeling his heart beat against her chest with the stubborn persistence of hope itself, she realized something that would sustain her through the dark hours ahead. She'd never failed to love him, never failed to fight for him, never failed to choose him over every other consideration in her life. That love, fierce and unwavering, and worth more than all the job security in the world, was the one thing Harrison couldn't take away from her. The security guards returned 20 minutes later, their heavy footsteps echoing through the parking garage, like drum beats announcing an execution. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them approach, their faces wearing the professionally blank expressions of men who'd been ordered to remove a problem and intended to do so efficiently. "Ma'am, you need to move along," the taller guard said, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd delivered this message countless times before. "This is private property. You can't stay here." Sarah looked up at him, Liam still burning with fever in her arms. "Please, just until morning. He's sick and we don't have anywhere else to go. I won't cause any trouble, I promise." The shorter guard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Sarah's desperate face and Liam's pale, sweating form. For a moment, something human flickered in his expression. Perhaps he had children of his own, Perhaps he recognized the particular helplessness of a parent watching their child suffer. But then his radio crackled, and Harrison's voice cut through the moment like a scythe. "Status report. Is the cleaning woman gone yet?" "We're handling it, sir," the tall guard responded, his brief hesitation betraying the distaste he felt for the situation. "Moving them along now." "Good. Make sure she doesn't come back. The last thing we need is some homeless woman camping out in our garage, creating liability issues." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Homeless woman. After 2 years of perfect service, of making their building spotless while they slept in their comfortable homes, she'd been reduced to a liability issue, a problem to be managed and discarded. "You heard him," the tall guard said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. "I'm sorry, but you can't stay here." Sarah stood slowly, her legs shaking from exhaustion and cold. Liam whimpered as the movement disturbed his restless sleep, his small hands clutching at her uniform, with the desperate grip of someone who sensed that safety was slipping away. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, the question directed more to the universe than to the guards. "The shelter's full. I called 17 times today. The emergency room will only keep him for a few hours before they send us away again. I lost my job, I have no money, and my son is dying by degrees while everyone acts like we're invisible." The shorter guard reached into his wallet, pulling out a $20 bill with the guilty quickness of someone performing an act of charity they didn't want witnessed. "There's a diner about 6 blocks north," he said quietly. "They're open all night. You can probably sit there for a while if you buy something. $20. It might buy them a few hours of warmth and maybe a cup of soup for Liam, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental equation that had become Sarah's life. No job meant no money. No money meant no shelter. No shelter meant watching her son deteriorate, while she stood helpless and invisible on the margins of a society that had forgotten people like them existed. She took the money with trembling fingers, the small kindness somehow making her situation feel even more desperate. "Thank you," she managed, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. As they walked away from the building that had been her workplace, her sanctuary, her last connection to stability, Sarah felt something inside her finally shatter completely. Not break. Breaking implied the possibility of repair. This was different. This was the complete dissolution of everything she'd believed about fairness, about hard work being rewarded, about the basic human decency that was supposed to connect people in moments of crisis. The diner was a harsh fluorescent oasis in a desert of closed businesses and empty streets. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and sensible shoes, looked up as Sarah entered carrying Liam, taking in their disheveled appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen poverty in all its forms. "Just coffee," Sarah said, settling into a booth in the back corner where Liam could lie across the vinyl seat. The $20 would have to last, and coffee was the cheapest way to buy time and warmth. "Honey, that boy needs more than coffee," the waitress said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense kindness of someone who'd raised children on minimum wage and tips. "When's the last time either of you ate something substantial?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah couldn't remember. Time had become fluid since the crisis began, measured not in hours or days, but in the intervals between Liam's breathing episodes, between trips to the emergency room, between moments of hope and moments of despair. "We're fine," Sarah lied, the words automatic after months of practice. Admitting need had become too dangerous, too likely to result in investigations and questions, and the possibility that someone would decide she was an unfit mother who should have her son taken away and placed with a family who could provide what she couldn't. The waitress, her name tag read Betty, wasn't fooled. She returned a few minutes later with 2 bowls of soup, a grilled cheese sandwich cut into triangles, and a glass of milk that she set in front of Liam's sleeping form. "How special," she said with a wink that suggested this kindness was a regular occurrence. "On the house for new customers." Sarah stared at the food through tears she refused to let fall. Even here, among strangers who owed her nothing, she found more consideration than she'd received from people who'd known her for years, who'd watched her work herself to exhaustion while they counted profits and calculated bonuses. As Liam stirred and began to eat with the slow, careful movements of someone whose body was conserving energy for basic survival, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She almost ignored it. Who would be contacting her at 3 a.m.? But something made her check. The message was from Harrison. "Sarah, I've been thinking about tonight's incident. While I understand your desperation, I feel I should inform you that we've discovered some discrepancies in the cleaning supply inventory. Several items appear to be missing, including industrial-grade disinfectants and paper products. I'm sure you understand that these are serious allegations that could result in criminal charges. However, given your long service and your current circumstances, I'm willing to overlook this matter if you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your employment here. This would prevent you from discussing your termination with other potential employers or pursuing any legal action against the company. Consider it our final act of generosity. You have until noon tomorrow to respond. The words swam before Sarah's eyes as their meaning sank in. Theft. He was accusing her of theft, threatening criminal charges if she didn't sign away her right to tell the truth about what had happened. The supplies he mentioned, she'd used some of them to clean the motel room where they'd been staying, trying to make the mold-infested space safe for Liam's compromised lungs. She'd assumed it was acceptable, a small compensation for the unpaid overtime she'd worked, the holidays she'd sacrificed, the dignity she'd surrendered. Now her desperation was being twisted into criminality, her attempts to keep her son alive transformed into evidence of moral failing. Harrison wasn't just firing her. He was ensuring she'd never work again, never find another job that would provide the insurance Liam needed to survive. She read the message 3 times, each reading driving the knife of betrayal deeper into her chest. This was how loyalty was repaid, how sacrifice was acknowledged, how 24 months of perfect service were remembered. Not with gratitude or understanding, but with threats and manipulation designed to ensure her silence while they protected their reputation. Betty appeared at her table again, refilling her coffee cup with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes the smallest kindnesses carried the greatest weight. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked, noticing Sarah's stricken expression. Sarah looked up at this stranger, who'd shown her more compassion in 30 minutes than her former employer had shown in 2 years. "No," she whispered, the admission feeling like another small death. "Nothing's okay." In that moment, sitting in a diner at 3 a.m. with her fevered son sleeping beside her, and her phone glowing with threats from a man who'd never seen her as human, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her faith in justice, in fairness, in the basic decency of the world finally crumble into dust. She was alone, truly alone, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to fall. But sometimes she would learn, hitting bottom was the only way to discover what you were truly made of. Word traveled fast through the gleaming corridors of Bennett and Associates. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the story had been sanitized, repackaged, and distributed through the corporate ecosystem with the efficiency of a well-oiled public relations machine. The official version was clean, legal, and completely devoid of human complexity. A cleaning service employee was terminated for violating security protocols by bringing unauthorized personnel into the building during operating hours. Sarah discovered this when her phone began buzzing with calls from other members of the cleaning crew, women who worked the day shift in other office buildings throughout Chicago, part of the invisible army that kept corporate America spotless. They'd heard whispers, fragments of the story filtered through supervisors and security guards, and they wanted to know if it was true. "Is it real, Sarah?" asked Maria, who cleaned the law offices on State Street. "Did they really fire you for bringing Liam to work?" "They're saying you stole supplies," added Carmen, her voice tight with worry, "that you were using company cleaning products at home. Is that why they let you go?" Sarah sat in the diner booth where she'd spent the night, Liam still sleeping fitfully beside her, and felt the weight of understanding settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The narrative was already being shaped, her desperation transformed into criminality, her maternal instinct reframed as theft and deception. By the time the story finished circulating, she wouldn't just be unemployed, she'd be unemployable. "I used some disinfectant to clean our motel room," she admitted quietly. "Liam's lungs can't handle mold and the room it wasn't clean. I thought maybe after 2 years of working overtime without extra pay, after covering shifts during the holidays, while everyone else was with their families." "Ay, mija." Maria's voice carried the weight of shared understanding. "You know that doesn't matter to them. They don't see the overtime, the holidays, the loyalty. They just see an excuse to protect themselves." The calls continued throughout the morning, each one adding another layer to Sarah's growing comprehension of how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Harrison hadn't just fired her, he'd systematically destroyed her reputation, ensuring that word would spread through the tight-knit community of cleaning service workers, making her toxic to any potential employer. By noon, when she was supposed to respond to Harrison's ultimatum about the non-disclosure agreement, Sarah had received a call that made the full scope of the conspiracy clear. It came from Janet Morrison, the day supervisor at Morrison Cleaning Services, the company that held the contract for 3 major office buildings in downtown Chicago. "Sarah, honey, I'm sorry, but I can't hire you," Janet said, her voice heavy with regret. "Word came down from Bennett and Associates this morning. They're saying you're not to be considered for any cleaning position in any building they have business relationships with. That's basically every major office building in the loop." The corporate web was tighter than Sarah had imagined. Bennett and Associates didn't just own their building. They had business relationships, partnerships, and informal networks that extended throughout Chicago's commercial district. A word from them could close doors she didn't even know existed, could blacklist her from an entire industry with a few strategic phone calls. "What am I supposed to do?" Sarah asked, watching Liam stir in his sleep, his forehead still burning with fever that seemed to spike whenever her stress levels increased, as if his small body was absorbing her fear and transforming it into physical symptoms. "I don't know, honey," Janet admitted. "Maybe try the suburban buildings, the smaller companies that don't have ties to the downtown network. But Sarah, you need to know they're calling you a security risk. They're saying you brought a sick child into a high-security environment during flu season, that you used company property for personal purposes. That's not going to just disappear." After she hung up, Sarah stared at her phone and felt the full weight of institutional power settling around her like quicksand. This wasn't just about one cruel supervisor or one unfortunate incident. This was about a system designed to protect wealth and reputation at the expense of individuals who had neither, a network of power that could erase someone like her with a few strategic conversations and carefully worded recommendations. The diner's lunch crowd was beginning to filter in. Construction workers with dirt under their fingernails, and office workers in wrinkled suits, people who worked with their hands, and people who worked with their minds, but all of them part of a world that had shelter and stability, and the luxury of eating lunch because they knew dinner was waiting for them at home. Betty approached their table again, her sensible shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. "How's the little one doing?" "The fever won't break," Sarah said, stroking Liam's hair with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and caffeine. "I need to get him to a doctor, but I lost my insurance when they fired me, and the emergency room will just give him a fever reducer and send us away again." Betty studied Liam's flushed face with the practiced eye of someone who'd raised children through countless illnesses. "That's not just a fever, honey. That's pneumonia fever. I've seen it before with my grandson. He needs real medicine, not emergency room band-aids." "I know," Sarah whispered, the admission feeling like another small failure. "But real medicine costs real money, and I don't have either." What happened next surprised Sarah more than anything that had occurred in the past 24 hours. Betty disappeared into the diner's back office and returned with a small silver-haired man in an expensive suit who moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "This is Mr. James Bennett," Betty said, her voice carrying a respect that seemed genuine rather than forced. "He owns this diner, among other things. He heard about your situation." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Bennett. As in Bennett and Associates, the company that had just destroyed her life and reputation with clinical efficiency. She instinctively pulled Liam closer, her mother's protective instincts flaring even as her rational mind recognized the impossibility of escape. "I'm not here in any official capacity," James Bennett said, settling into the booth across from them with the unhurried movements of someone who'd learned that power was most effective when it didn't announce itself. "I heard what happened at my building last night. I wanted to hear your side of the story." His voice was nothing like Harrison's. There was no condescension, no barely concealed irritation, no suggestion that her time was being grudgingly allocated by someone with more important concerns. Instead, there was something Sarah hadn't heard in so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Genuine curiosity about her experience as a human being rather than as a problem to be managed. "Your side," Sarah repeated, the phrase feeling foreign in her mouth. "No one's ever asked for my side before." "I'm asking now," he said simply. "What happened? Not the official version, not the sanitized report that's probably sitting on my desk right now. What really happened?" So she told him. Not the careful, defensive version she'd rehearsed for potential employers, not the abbreviated explanation she'd given to the other cleaning workers, but the full, unvarnished truth about desperation and impossible choices and the systematic erosion of dignity that occurred when survival required accepting treatment no human being should have to endure. She told him about the 2 years of perfect service that had earned her nothing but increased expectations and decreased respect. About the overtime she'd worked without compensation, the holidays she'd sacrificed, the personal emergencies she'd minimized to avoid inconveniencing people who'd never reciprocated her consideration. She told him about Liam's illness, about the medical bills that consumed every dollar she earned, about the impossible mathematics of poverty that meant choosing between medicine and shelter, between food and warmth, between her son's immediate needs and their long-term survival. And she told him about the hiding place under the conference table, about the calculation that had led her to believe that keeping her child safe and warm for a few hours was worth the risk of discovery, about the moment when desperation had finally outweighed fear. James Bennet listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression never shifting into the polite mask of someone waiting for an uncomfortable conversation to end. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah's exhausted features and Liam's fevered sleep. "I have a son," he said finally. "He's about your age now, works in the business, thinks he understands how the world operates." He paused, something almost like regret flickering across his features. "I wonder if he would have made the same choices you did, if he would have shown the same courage." Courage. The word hung in the air between them like an offering, a reframing of her desperation as something noble rather than shameful, her impossible choices as evidence of strength rather than failure. For the first time in 24 hours, Sarah felt something other than despair beginning to take root in her chest. James Bennet excused himself from the table, stepping outside to make a phone call while Sarah sat in the booth, her world tilting on an axis she couldn't quite comprehend. Through the diner's plate glass window, she watched him pace back and forth on the sidewalk, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing with the controlled intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed lives. Liam stirred in his sleep, his small hand reaching out instinctively for the comfort of his mother's touch. His fever had spiked again, turning his cheeks the deep red of roses blooming in winter, beautiful and wrong and desperately fragile. Sarah pressed her palm to his forehead and felt the heat radiating through his skin like a small engine running too hot, too fast, burning itself out in its desperate attempt to keep functioning. "Mommy!" Liam's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes opening to reveal the glassy confusion that accompanied high fevers. "Are we going home now?" Home. The word pierced Sarah's heart with surgical precision. They had no home, no place where they belonged, no sanctuary waiting for them at the end of this nightmare. The motel room had been lost when she couldn't make the weekly payment, their belongings scattered to the wind along with everything else that had once made them feel like a family rather than refugees in their own lives. "Soon, baby," she lied, the words tasting like copper pennies in her mouth. "Mommy's working on it." It was then that James Bennet returned, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked Harrison, his face wearing the expression of a man who'd been summoned to explain himself to someone he couldn't afford to disappoint. The supervisor's usual arrogance had been replaced by something Sarah had never seen before: uncertainty. "Mr. Bennet, I assure you this is all a misunderstanding," Harrison began before he'd even reached the table, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to control a narrative that was slipping away from him. The woman was clearly in violation of multiple security protocols. "We had no choice but to—" "Sit down, Richard," James Bennet said quietly, and something in his tone made Harrison's mouth snap shut mid-sentence. "I want you to look at this woman and her child. Really look at them. Then I want you to explain to me how we got here." Harrison's eyes darted between James Bennet's face and Sarah's, clearly trying to calculate which version of events would best serve his interests. "Sir, she brought an unauthorized person into a secure building. She used company property for personal purposes. She violated the terms of her employment contract in multiple ways. She hid her sick child under a conference table," James Bennet interrupted, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undercurrent that made Harrison visibly flinch. "A child with pneumonia. A child whose mother had been working for us faithfully for 2 years, cleaning our offices while we slept in our comfortable beds, making our workspace pristine while she struggled to keep her son alive." Sarah watched this exchange with the detached fascination of someone witnessing their own execution. Here were two men discussing her fate, as if she were a business problem to be solved, rather than a human being whose life hung in the balance. But there was something different in James Bennett's approach, something that suggested he saw her as more than just collateral damage in a corporate decision. "Sir, with all due respect," Harrison continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone who knew he was losing control, "we can't set a precedent of allowing employees to bring personal problems into the workplace. What happens when word gets out that we're lenient about security violations? What happens when other employees start thinking they can—" "What happens," James Bennett said, his voice cutting through Harrison's excuses like a blade through paper, "when a company becomes so focused on policies and procedures that it forgets the human beings who make its success possible." He turned to Sarah, his eyes holding an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Tell me about the night you first brought Liam to work." Sarah's throat constricted. No one had ever asked her to explain the decision, to voice the impossible calculation that had led her to risk everything for a few hours of safety and warmth for her child. They'd judged the action without understanding the desperation that had driven it. "He'd been in the emergency room for 6 hours, she began, her voice barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. "They said his fever was too high, that I needed to monitor his breathing every 15 minutes. But I couldn't miss work. I'd already used my sick days when he was hospitalized the month before. The neighbor who usually watched him was sick herself. The babysitter I sometimes used wouldn't take him because of his condition." She paused, watching Harrison's face as she spoke, seeing the way his expression remained fixed in its mask of professional disapproval, even as she described circumstances that should have evoked basic human sympathy. "I called the office," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the words began to flow. "I spoke to Mr. Harrison. I explained that my son was seriously ill, that I needed just one night off to care for him. I offered to make up the hours on my weekend, to work extra shifts, anything to avoid leaving him alone when he was struggling to breathe." "And what did I tell you?" James Bennett asked Harrison, though his eyes never left Sarah's face. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I explained that we had important clients coming in the next day, that the offices needed to be cleaned according to schedule." "You told her," Sarah interrupted, her voice suddenly clear and strong, "that my personal problems weren't your concern. You told me that if I couldn't fulfill my job responsibilities, there were plenty of other people who could." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and for the first time since she'd been fired, Sarah felt something other than shame coursing through her veins. It was anger, clean, righteous anger at the systematic dehumanization she'd endured, at the way her dedication had been twisted into obligation, her desperation exploited as weakness. "So I brought him with me," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I wrapped him in blankets and made a bed under the conference table where it was warm and safe. I checked on him every few minutes while I worked. I made sure he was comfortable and quiet. I did my job perfectly while caring for a sick child, and you know what? The offices were spotless the next morning. Your important clients saw exactly what they expected to see. A perfect, sterile environment, maintained by invisible people they never had to think about." Harrison's face had grown pale during her recitation, and Sarah realized that James Bennett was recording everything on his phone, creating a permanent record of this conversation. "How many nights did this go on?" James Bennett asked. 3 months, Sarah admitted. 3 months when I had no other choice, when every other option had been exhausted, when the alternative was leaving a sick child alone or losing the job that provided his health insurance. She looked directly at Harrison, meeting his eyes for the first time since the confrontation in the conference room. 3 months when I did everything you asked of me and more, when I sacrificed my own rest and health to ensure that your building was perfect every morning, when I chose loyalty to a company that never showed any loyalty to me. "This is all very emotional," Harrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to dismiss concerns without addressing them. "But the fact remains that company policy, James Bennett said quietly, is supposed to serve human beings, not the other way around." He stood up from the table with the deliberate movements of someone who'd reached a decision that couldn't be reversed. "Richard, you're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you'll receive the same severance package you thought appropriate for Sarah, which is to say, none." Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, indignation, and finally a desperate calculation, as he realized that his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed professional identity was crumbling around him with the same speed and thoroughness with which he'd destroyed Sarah's. "Sir, you can't. I was following protocol." "You were following the protocol of cruelty," James Bennett said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "The protocol of treating human beings as disposable resources rather than as people deserving of basic dignity and consideration." He turned back to Sarah, his expression softening in a way that made her throat tighten with unshed tears. "You, on the other hand, are not fired. You never were. What happened last night was not a termination. It was a revelation of everything that's wrong with how we've been operating." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand." "You're not going back to cleaning offices," he said simply. "You're going to help me fix a system that allowed what happened to you to happen at all. You're going to help me build something better." In that moment, sitting in a diner booth with her fevered son sleeping beside her, Sarah felt something she'd thought was lost forever beginning to stir in her chest. Hope. The first concrete change came within an hour. James Bennett made 3 phone calls from the diner booth, one to his personal physician, one to his company's human resources director, and one to a pediatric specialist at Chicago Children's Hospital. By 2 p.m., Sarah found herself sitting in Dr. Elena Rodriguez's office, while Liam underwent a comprehensive examination that included blood work, chest x-rays, and a consultation that would have cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. "Pneumonia, as you suspected," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd delivered both devastating and hopeful news to countless parents. "But it's treatable. We're going to start him on a stronger antibiotic regimen, and I want to see him twice a week until his lungs clear completely." Sarah's first instinct was the familiar panic about costs, about insurance coverage, about the inevitable financial devastation that followed any serious medical intervention. But when she opened her mouth to ask about payment plans and charity care options, Dr. Rodriguez held up a gentle hand. "Everything is covered," she said simply. "Mr. Bennett has established a medical fund for Liam that will handle all his care, including the specialist treatments he'll need for his chronic condition. Your job now is to focus on being his mother, not his insurance coordinator." The relief was so overwhelming that Sarah had to press her hand to her chest to keep from sobbing in the doctor's office. For 2 years, every medical decision had been filtered through a brutal economic calculation. Was the treatment essential enough to justify the debt? Could they survive another month of payment plans? Was it worth risking financial ruin to address symptoms that might resolve on their own? Now, for the first time since Liam's diagnosis, she could simply say yes to whatever he needed without calculating the cost in sleepless nights and skipped meals and desperate choices between medication and rent. Dr. Rodriguez continued outlining the treatment plan, her words washing over Sarah like gentle rain after a drought. Physical therapy to strengthen Liam's lungs, nutritional supplements to help his body fight infection, a consultation with a respiratory specialist who could develop a long-term management strategy for his condition. "He's going to be fine, Doctor," Rodriguez said, making eye contact with the intensity of someone who understood that parents needed hope as much as children needed medicine. "More than fine. With proper care and nutrition, many children with his condition go on to live completely normal lives." Normal lives. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind as they left the hospital, with a prescription bag full of medications she didn't have to worry about affording and follow-up appointments she didn't have to stress about attending. Liam walked beside her with more energy than she'd seen from him in months, the antibiotics already beginning their work of fighting the infection that had been slowly sapping his strength. Their next stop was Bennett and Associates, but not the service entrance Sarah had used for 2 years. This time they walked through the main lobby with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, past the security desk, where guards nodded respectfully, rather than viewing them as potential threats to be managed. James Bennett met them at the executive elevator, his demeanor completely different from the desperate supervisor who'd fired her 36 hours earlier. Here was a man comfortable with power but not corrupted by it, someone who understood that true authority came from lifting others up rather than keeping them down. "I want to show you something," he said, as the elevator climbed toward the building's upper floors. "A project I've been thinking about for months but didn't know how to begin." The elevator opened onto a floor Sarah had never seen, one that was completely empty, except for architectural plans spread across folding tables and a few pieces of furniture covered in protective plastic. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that felt full of potential, rather than the sterile corporate functionality of the offices below. "This is going to be the headquarters for a new division," James Bennett explained, walking toward the windows that offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline. Home Strong, a comprehensive support system for working families who find themselves caught between economic pressures they can't control and basic human needs they can't ignore. He gestured toward the architectural plans with the enthusiasm of someone describing a dream that was finally becoming reality. Childcare services for parents working non-traditional hours, medical support for families dealing with chronic conditions, emergency housing assistance for people caught in temporary crises, job training and placement programs that focus on career advancement rather than just temporary employment. Sarah studied the plans, seeing conference rooms and play areas, medical consultation spaces and computer labs, a dozen different ways of addressing the systematic problems that had nearly destroyed her family. But what struck her most was the attention to dignity. Private offices for consultations, comfortable waiting areas, spaces designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. "I need someone to run it," James Bennett continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Someone who understands the problems we're trying to solve, not from academic research or theoretical frameworks, but from lived experience. Someone who's navigated the system from the inside and can identify the gaps between what's supposed to work and what actually works." The implication hung in the air between them like a bridge Sarah was afraid to cross. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a calling," he corrected gently. "The chance to build something that could prevent other families from experiencing what you've been through. The opportunity to transform your suffering into other people's salvation." Sarah walked to the windows, looking out at the city where thousands of families were fighting the same battles she'd fought, making the same impossible choices between survival and dignity, between their children's immediate needs and their family's long-term stability. Somewhere out there, another single mother was probably hiding her sick child in a workplace, hoping for just enough time and safety to get through another day. "I don't have the education," she said, voicing the fear that had kept her trapped in minimum-wage jobs, despite intelligence and intuition that could have taken her much further. "I don't have a degree in social work or business management or any of the credentials people expect from someone running a program like this." "You have something better," James Bennett replied. "You have authenticity. You have the trust that comes from shared experience. You have the moral authority that can only be earned through suffering and survival." He moved to stand beside her at the window, both of them looking out at the city that had been simultaneously hostile and home to her family. "Do you know what convinced me that you were the right person for this job? It wasn't your work ethic, though that's impressive. It wasn't your dedication to your son, though that's admirable. Say it was the way you talked about the other cleaning women who called you this morning." Sarah remembered those conversations, the worry in Maria's voice, the fear in Carmen's words, the shared understanding that what happened to one of them could happen to any of them. "You didn't just think about yourself," he continued. "Even in the middle of your own crisis, you were concerned about how the story was affecting other women in similar situations. You understood that your experience was part of a larger pattern, that your suffering was connected to systematic problems that couldn't be solved by individual charity or personal bootstrap pulling." The truth of this observation settled over Sarah like a warm blanket. She had been thinking about the other women, worried about how the rumors and accusations might affect their employment prospects, concerned that her desperation might be used to justify treating all cleaning workers with additional suspicion and contempt. "The position comes with a salary that will allow you to live with dignity," James Bennett continued, naming a figure that made Sarah's knees go weak. "Health insurance that will cover all of Liam's needs without copays or deductibles. Housing assistance until you can find a permanent place that meets your family's requirements. And most importantly, the resources and authority to help other families before they reach the crisis point you experienced." Liam had been exploring the empty office space while they talked, his energy returning with each dose of medicine. Now he appeared at Sarah's side, tugging gently on her sleeve. "Mommy, is this our new office?" he asked with the innocent directness that only children could manage. Sarah looked down at her son, her beautiful, brave, resilient son who'd endured poverty and illness and uncertainty with grace that humbled her. and saw in his eyes the reflection of a future that seemed suddenly, impossibly bright. "Yes, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she no longer needed to hide. "I think it is." 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the Home Strong office, wearing a navy blue dress that fit her properly, not because it was the cheapest option available, but because she'd chosen it for the way it made her feel confident and professional. Her hair, once pulled back in the utilitarian ponytail of someone too exhausted for vanity, now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. But the most striking change wasn't visible in her appearance. It was in the way she carried herself, with the quiet dignity of someone who discovered her own worth. The office hummed with purposeful activity. In the children's area, 12 kids played under the supervision of qualified childcare workers, while their parents attended job interviews, medical appointments, or simply took a few hours to handle the bureaucratic requirements of rebuilding their lives. The medical consultation room hosted Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatrician who donated 4 hours a week to provide free healthcare for families transitioning out of crisis. In the computer lab, 8 adults worked on resume writing, job applications, and online training courses, designed to help them move from survival employment to career track positions. Many of them were single mothers who, like Sarah had been, possessed intelligence and capability that had been buried under the daily grind of simply staying alive. Mrs. Martinez, the voice belonged to Elena Vasquez, a young woman whose story echoed Sarah's own in heartbreaking detail. Elena had been working 3 part-time jobs to support her daughter while attending community college nursing classes when a car accident left her unable to work for 6 weeks. By the time she recovered, she'd lost all 3 jobs, fallen behind on rent, and been forced to drop out of school. "Please call me Sarah," she replied, settling into the chair across from Elena in her private office, a space that still felt miraculous to her, with its comfortable furniture and plants that thrived under proper care, so different from the harsh fluorescent environment where she'd once been invisible. "I wanted to thank you," Elena continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The emergency housing assistance bought me time to find a new job, and the childcare vouchers mean I can work full-time hours instead of trying to piece together shifts around my daughter's schedule. But more than that," she paused, searching for words to express something that went beyond practical assistance. "More than that, you listened to me. You believed me when I said I wasn't lazy or irresponsible, that I was just caught in circumstances beyond my control. Do you know how long it's been since someone in an official capacity treated me like a person instead of a problem?" Sarah did know. She remembered every interaction with social services workers who viewed poverty as a character flaw, every conversation with supervisors who treated desperation as an inconvenience, every moment when her humanity had been reduced to case numbers and policy violations. "You're not a problem," Sarah said firmly. "You're a solution that hasn't been properly supported yet. The difference between success and failure often comes down to having someone in your corner when the system seems designed to knock you down." Elena nodded, tears beginning to flow. "My daughter asked me yesterday if we were going to be okay now. I told her yes, and for the first time in 2 years, I actually believed it." These conversations happened daily in Sarah's office. Women and men who'd been written off by a society that measured worth in dollars and viewed poverty as a moral failing, discovering that they were capable of so much more when given genuine support and basic respect. Each success story felt personal to Sarah, a small victory against the forces that had nearly destroyed her own family. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. James Bennett appeared in her doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner, where they'd first had their real conversation. Betty's diner had become something of a pilgrimage site for them, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change when someone chose to see possibility instead of problems. "How are the numbers looking?" he asked, settling into the chair Elena had vacated. Sarah consulted the monthly report on her desk, though she knew the figures by heart. "We've served 847 families in 6 months. 73% of our job placement participants have retained employment for at least 3 months. 89% of children in our emergency childcare program have maintained consistent school attendance. And perhaps most importantly, we've prevented 34 families from entering homelessness by providing intervention before they reached crisis point." The statistics were impressive, but they represented more than data points to Sarah. Each number was a family that wouldn't experience the terror she'd felt sitting in that parking garage, a child who wouldn't have to hide under a conference table, a parent who wouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. More than the numbers, though, she continued. We're changing the conversation. Other companies are starting to ask how they can better support their employees who are struggling with family crises. 3 major corporations have contacted us about implementing family-friendly policies that go beyond the minimum legal requirements. James Bennett smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose investment was paying dividends in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. And how are you doing? Really? The question was one he asked regularly, understanding that trauma didn't disappear overnight, even when circumstances improved dramatically. Sarah had spent several months working with a therapist to process the psychological impact of sustained crisis, learning to trust that stability wouldn't vanish without warning, that she was allowed to plan for a future that extended beyond next week's rent payment. I'm learning to believe in permanence again, she said honestly. For the longest time I was afraid to relax, afraid that if I stopped being hyper-vigilant about potential disasters, everything would fall apart again. But I'm starting to understand that security isn't just about having enough money. It's about having systems and relationships that can weather unexpected challenges. The truth was that Sarah had discovered something she'd never expected. Her experience of systematic devaluation had prepared her uniquely for leadership. She could spot the signs of stress and desperation in clients before they reached breaking points. She could navigate bureaucratic systems with the efficiency of someone who understood how to work within constraints, while advocating for necessary changes. Most importantly, she could offer hope that felt authentic because it was grounded in lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. There's something else I wanted to discuss, James Bennett said, his tone shifting to the careful formality he used when introducing significant topics. The Homestrong model is attracting attention from other cities. We've had inquiries from Detroit, Atlanta, and Phoenix about implementing similar programs. I think we're ready to expand. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the prospect of increased responsibility, but it was tempered by excitement about the possibility of helping more families. What would that look like? It would mean travel, training new coordinators, adapting the program to different regional needs and resources. It would mean becoming the public face of an initiative that could transform how social services operate across the country. He paused, studying her expression. It would mean congressional testimony, media interviews, speaking at conferences where you'd be the expert rather than the case study. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago, invisible, voiceless, convinced that her opinions and experiences didn't matter to anyone with the power to create change. That woman could never have imagined sitting in a professional office discussing policy implementation and systemic reform. I'll need to think about the travel schedule, she said finally. Liam's health is stable now, but I don't want to risk the consistency he needs. Of course. Family first. That's not just our program philosophy, it's our operational priority. We'll structure everything around what works for your family. As if summoned by his name, Liam appeared in the doorway, no longer the pale, fevered child who'd hidden under conference tables. 6 months of proper nutrition, consistent medical care, and emotional stability had transformed him into a healthy 8-year-old whose energy seemed boundless. He'd started 3rd grade at a school where his medical history was managed by professionals rather than worried by his mother, where he could focus on learning and friendship rather than simply surviving each day. Mom, Ms. Rodriguez wants to know if you can help her with something, he said, then noticed James Bennett and offered a polite wave. Hi, Mr. Bennett. Hi, Liam. How's school going? Really good. I'm reading at 5th grade level now, and I'm in the advanced math group. My teacher says I'm really smart. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the confidence of a child who'd learned that his intelligence was valued rather than irrelevant to his daily survival. That's wonderful, James Bennett replied. Your mom's really smart too. Did you know she's helping families all over the country now? Liam looked at Sarah with the uncomplicated admiration that children reserve for parents who've kept them safe against impossible odds. I know. She's the best at helping people. After Liam left to return to the after-school program that kept him occupied and supervised while Sarah finished her workday, she and James Bennett sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Through her office window, Sarah could see the Chicago skyline that had once seemed like a wall between her circumstances and any better future. Now it looked like a horizon full of possibility. You know what I think about sometimes, she said finally. All the women who are sitting in parking garages right now, or hiding in bathrooms at work crying, or lying awake at night trying to solve problems that seem impossible. I think about how many of them could do what I'm doing now if someone just gave them the chance. That's exactly why this program works, James Bennett replied, because it's not about charity or sympathy. It's about recognizing potential that's been buried under circumstances and creating pathways for people to discover what they're actually capable of. Sarah nodded, understanding now that her transformation had been less about changing who she was and more about finally having the opportunity to become who she'd always been underneath the desperation and exhaustion. The woman who'd hidden her child under a conference table had possessed the same intelligence, compassion, and determination that now guided Homestrong's operations. The difference was that now those qualities were valued rather than dismissed, supported rather than exploited. "I'm ready for the expansion," she said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment. "Let's help more families." 2 years later, Sarah stood before a joint session of the House and Senate subcommittees on social services, her voice steady as she addressed the assembled lawmakers whose decisions would affect millions of families across America. The woman who had once been invisible, who had cleaned these very halls in buildings like this one during overnight shifts when the powerful slept peacefully in their beds, now commanded the attention of senators and representatives who leaned forward to catch every word of her testimony. "Honorable members of Congress," she began, her hands resting calmly on the polished mahogany podium. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm here to tell you about the night I was fired for hiding my sick son under a conference table." The room, which had buzzed with the low murmur of political conversation, fell completely silent. Sarah had learned that her story possessed a power that statistics and policy papers could never match, the power of truth spoken by someone who had lived it. She told them about Liam's fever, about the impossible choice between leaving a chronically ill child alone and losing the job that provided his health care. She described the systematic dehumanization that occurred when survival required accepting treatment no person should have to endure, the way poverty became a trap that closed tighter with each desperate attempt to escape it. But more importantly, she told them about transformation, not just her own, but the transformation of over 2,000 families who had been served by Homestrong's programs across 7 cities. She spoke about Elena Vasquez, who had graduated from nursing school the previous month and was now working in the pediatric ward of Chicago Children's Hospital. About Marcus Thompson, a single father who had been living in his car with his 2 daughters and was now a certified electrician with stable housing and a savings account. The difference between success and failure, she told the lawmakers, is often not about personal character or individual effort. It's about having systems in place that catch people when they fall instead of systems that punish them for falling. The questions that followed were pointed but respectful, and Sarah answered each one with the authority of lived experience combined with policy expertise she'd developed through 2 years of running programs that actually worked. When Senator Patricia Williams from Ohio asked about cost-effectiveness, Sarah provided data showing that prevention programs cost 1/10 as much as crisis intervention. When Representative James Foster from Texas questioned the scalability of individualized support, Sarah described the replicable frameworks that had been successfully implemented across diverse urban and rural communities. After the hearing, Sarah walked down the marble steps of the Capitol building into the warm September afternoon, her phone already buzzing with calls from advocacy organizations, policy institutes, and media outlets who wanted to discuss her testimony. But she ignored them all, instead calling the person whose opinion mattered most. "Liam, how was school today?" "Mom," his voice carried the excitement of a 10-year-old who had news to share. "I got chosen for the gifted program. And guess what? I told Mrs. Peterson about how you're in Washington talking to Congress, and she said maybe I could be president someday too." Sarah smiled, remembering the child who had once whispered, "Mommy, where were you?" from a hospital bed, now dreaming of futures that seemed limitless. "You could be anything you want to be, baby. Anything at all. Are you coming home tonight?" "Tomorrow afternoon," she promised. "And this weekend we're going to celebrate. Just you and me." The flight back to Chicago gave Sarah time to reflect on the journey that had brought her from that parking garage to the halls of Congress. She thought about Harrison, who had been quietly dismissed from several subsequent positions when his pattern of treating employees as disposable resources became apparent to other employers. She'd heard through professional networks that he was working in a much smaller company now, his authority significantly reduced, his reputation permanently marked by the incident that had revealed his character. But mostly, Sarah thought about the women she'd met through Homestrong, women who reminded her daily that her story wasn't unique, that millions of families lived on the razor's edge between stability and catastrophe, that the difference between success and failure often came down to nothing more than timing and luck, and whether someone with power chose to see possibility instead of problems. There was Maria Santos, a young mother who had been evicted from her apartment when her minimum wage job couldn't cover both rent and her daughter's asthma medications. Homestrong had provided emergency housing assistance and connected her with a job training program in medical administration. 6 months later, Maria was working full-time at a pediatric clinic, earning enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood where her daughter could attend a school with a nurse on staff. There was Robert Chen, a widowed father whose wife's death from cancer had left him not only grieving but financially devastated by medical bills that insurance hadn't covered. He'd been working 2 part-time jobs while trying to care for 3 young children, sleeping 4 hours a night and still falling further behind on basic expenses. Homestrong's childcare assistance had allowed him to accept a full-time position with benefits, and their financial counseling program had helped him negotiate payment plans that allowed him to keep his house while gradually eliminating the debt. Each success story felt personal to Sarah because she understood the desperation that preceded the hope, the way crisis could strip away everything except the fierce love that drove parents to keep fighting for their children, no matter how impossible the circumstances seemed. But perhaps the most profound transformation had been her own relationship with James Bennett, which had evolved from gratitude to genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to social justice. He had become not just her employer, but her mentor, teaching her to navigate boardrooms and political conversations with the same confidence she'd developed in understanding the needs of struggling families. "You've changed too," she told him recently over coffee at Betty's Diner, which had become their traditional meeting place for important conversations. "You're not the same person who built a business empire without thinking about the human cost of corporate policies." "I had guilty conscience," he'd replied, with the self-deprecating humor that had replaced the unconscious arrogance of inherited wealth. "It took meeting you to realize that I'd been walking past suffering I could easily address, that I'd been part of systems that created the very problems I claimed to care about solving." The plane began its descent into Chicago, and Sarah looked out the window at the city lights spreading below like earthbound constellations. Somewhere down there, in apartments and shelters, and maybe even in parking garages, families were fighting the same battles she'd fought, making the same impossible choices between dignity and survival. But now there were more resources available, more people who understood that poverty wasn't a character flaw, but a circumstance that could be changed with proper support. Homestrong had inspired similar programs in dozens of cities, creating a network of assistance that prioritized human dignity alongside practical help. The taxi ride from the airport took her through neighborhoods where she'd once searched desperately for affordable housing, past the emergency room where she'd spent countless nights with Liam, past the building where she'd been fired for the crime of being a devoted mother. These landmarks no longer triggered panic or shame. Instead, they served as mileposts marking how far she'd traveled, both literally and metaphorically. Her apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom in a building with a doorman and a playground where Liam could play safely, still felt miraculous to her sometimes, not because of its luxury but because of what it represented: the possibility of permanence, the luxury of planning for a future that extended beyond next week's rent payment. Liam was asleep when she arrived home, but she found a drawing on her pillow, a crayon illustration of 2 figures standing in front of a building labeled Homestrong, with a caption written in his careful 4th-grade handwriting, "My mum helps people." That simple statement contained more validation than any congressional testimony or media coverage could provide. Her son understood what she did, was proud of what she'd built from the ashes of their shared crisis, and most importantly, had learned that strength could emerge from suffering, that setbacks could become setups for something better. Sarah had learned something profound through her transformation. The qualities that had made her a good cleaning woman, attention to detail, dedication to excellence, understanding of what it meant to serve others, were the same qualities that made her an effective advocate and administrator. The difference wasn't in her capabilities, but in how those capabilities were valued and supported by the systems around her. She thought about all the people who might be reading her story, who might recognize their own struggles in her experience. Some of them were probably feeling hopeless, convinced that their circumstances were permanent, that their voices didn't matter, that no one in positions of power would ever see them as anything more than problems to be managed. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever watched someone you love suffer, while powerful people treated your family's crisis as an inconvenience? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread this message to other people who need to know that their struggles matter, that their dignity has value, and that sometimes the most broken places in our lives become the foundation for our greatest strength. 2 years after being fired for hiding her sick son under a conference table, Sarah Martinez had become living proof that transformation was possible, that systems could change, that voices long silenced could learn to speak with authority and compassion born from survived suffering. The woman who had once been invisible now stood in spotlights, but she never forgot the darkness that had taught her to appreciate the light. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.